Good evening, and welcome to our Waltham Public Library program, Conjure Women, with author Afia Atakora. My name is Deborah Hoffman, and I organize programs and events for the library. Thanks for tuning in. Before we start, I want to let you know how the evening will go. Afia Atakora will set the scene for us and do a reading from her book, and then she and I will be in conversation for about 30 minutes, after which she'll field questions from you. To ask questions via the chat function, use a Google account to sign into YouTube. Feel free to write your questions at any time, and then they'll be answered during the Q&A. Afia Atakora holds an MFA from Columbia University, where she was the recipient of the D'Alba Fellowship. She won the 2021 Lannan Literary Fellowship, and her debut novel, Conjure Women, has been awarded the Society of American Historians Prize for Historical Fiction. She was born in the United Kingdom and raised in New Jersey, where she now lives. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. So with that, I'll do a little introduction of Conjure Women. Is my debut novel. It came out in April 2020. And I'm really proud of what I was able to sort of explore in this novel. It's exploration of a time period in history, the Reconstruction era. And that was sort of my interest, sort of exploring what it was like just after the Civil War, what it was like for recently freed slaves to sort of make a life for themselves. So in writing Conjure Women, I wanted to explore that time period, and I also wanted to tell the story of a midwife and healer in this isolated community of recently freed slaves. With that, we have the main character, who is Rue, and we learn about her in the sort of graded timelines. We learn about her in freedom time, which are the years just after the Civil War. And we also learn about her in slavery time, when she reflects on the teachings of her mother when they were slaves and during the war. And we also meet Varina, who is the daughter of the slave master during slavery time, and who has sort of a complicated history with Rue. And the secrets of that relationship and their childhood unfold, shall we say, in the freedom time narrative, in which Rue is sort of faced with three challenges in protecting her community and the world she's now living in. And those challenges are the birth of a strange black-eyed child, the appearance of a charismatic preacher, and a strange sickness that is sweeping through the town and sort of threatening the peace that they've found for themselves. So there's a lot going on, but it's a sort of rich, sweeping narrative. And with that, I try to do a little peek into the world. I think I'll begin with the opening. It's okay. So this section is Freedom Time, 1867. Black babies crying, wormed and bloomed. It woke Rue by halves from her sleep, so that through the first few strains of the sound, she could not be sure when or where she was. But soon the feeble cry strengthened like a desperate knocking at her front door, and she came all the way awake and knew that she was needed again. She unwound herself from her thin linen sheet. There were dreams, she'd lost them now that she stood up. There was only the crying, not so loud as it was strange, unsettling. She smoothed her nighttime hair, made ready her face, stepped out from her cabin, barefooted. At the center of the town, between the gathering of low cabins that sat close and humble, Rue can make out a collection of books, like herself, who'd been drawn from their sleep with a haunting cry. Anxious, draggled, emerged to suppose at the unearthly sound. It was a moonless night, clouds colluding to block out the stars, and the crowd knitted itself tightly in a weave of black whisperings. "Hearing that, Miss Rue?" one of them said when she approached. What little light there was streamed down from behind the crowd, hiding them, illuminating Rue. She couldn't make out their faces for the darkness, but replied just the same. "Can't help but hearing about some poor suffering something." As she walked, already she was holding herself straighter, prouder. with what they were expecting. No matter how weary she was feeling on the inside, she knew she had to walk easy, like she were floating, same as her mama used to do. Rue's magic ought to be absolute, she knew, not come to them sleepwalking and unsure. It wasn't magic at all. Never heard nothing come close to that cry. No creature. It's one of Jonah's little ones. Who knew they suspected already what child it was? That wrong child, born backward in a call, back. Jonah himself was opening the front door of his cabin and stepping out of it. Rue did hope that Jonah, calm and right-headed, had come to silence the rumors on his child. But there was no denying that beyond him was the origin of the crying. Even his tower-tall presence in the doorway couldn't block out the menacing sound. Miss Rue, he called, and his voice was thin like river silk. There, Miss Rue? Rue did ache for Jonah's predicament. She answered, I'm here. Sarah's thinking the baby's took sick. She's wanting you to look him over. Rue stepped forward, took her time going up the few sunken down steps to the little porch. She could feel all of them eyes clinging to her back like hooks. At the top step, Jonah, dark-skinned and strong and sure, reached down for her and took her elbow in his hand, petting her. His calloused palms were hard against her bared skin, rough the way only a man's hand had caused to be, and as he moved her through the door, he gave the point of her elbow a slow rub, a caress away from their fastened eyes. Thank you, Miss Rue, he said, and showed her in. The home was made up of 2 rooms, more than most folks could boast. The thatch roof wept from some long ago storm. Rue followed Jonah to the front room's far corner where Sarah was knee-bent, washing their children. The tub was large enough to fit all 3 of Sarah and Jonah's little ones. Their elder boy and girl stood outside of it, naked, dry, waiting to be washed. Their faces were damp and ruddy beneath their high yellow skin, like they'd been crying, and had exhausted that sorrow, left it to the baby to do the weeping for them. Beside the tub, the baby was on his back, looking like a white island. Steam rose up from his skin in waves. He was crying. Lord, was he crying. Rue heard in it a lost cry, and it was a call she felt compelled to answer, not with comfort, but with a mournful cry of her own. In the water beside the baby, a chipped cup bobbed along the ripples created by his movement. It hit the walls of the tub out of time, high, piercing whine that had snaked its way into Rue's dreaming. When she leaned forward, the baby stilled his squall. He opened his eyes as if to look upon her, revealed the oil-slick black irises that had heralded his strangeness, had prompted the name Rue had given him at his birth, Black-Eyed Bean. Rue said to Sarah of the baby's eyes, "They ain't changed." She spoke it low enough to be out of Jonah's hearing. "No, they ain't," Sarah said, in just the same whisper. "He ain't changed." That's a little preview of the opening and Black-Eyed Bean's mysterious birth.
That just completely brought me back to your story. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
How would you describe your novel, Conjure Women?
Gosh, ambitious. I think there were a lot of things I wanted to explore. As I said at the top, I was fascinated by this point in history, and I think I just wanted to know what it would be like for these people. And so there's lots of characters, and there's sort of lots of short stories within the main story that sort of explore their relationships and sort of the psychological aspects of war and of freedom and of making a place for yourself in a world that told you wouldn't have a place, and sort of protecting the things you do have and the things you are proud of. And so it's the complicated time, specifically the Reconstruction era, because people just did not know what hope they had, what they could do for themselves, even with this idea of freedom. So I think that's something I keep returning to in the novel as well, is what is freedom and what does that look like and what can we sort of do with that? And also, what are the limitations? What are the choices that we are still beholden to because of our history?
Thank you. I've read that there are two types of writers, plotters who plan everything out and know how the story will go before they write, and pantsers who essentially write by the seat of their pants. What is your writing process?
I am definitely a pantser. Absolutely. I love that. I definitely think I discover the story as I go along. I think the joy of writing for me is sort of finding out what the story is going to be along with the reader. I find if I plan, I almost get stuck. I almost feel roped into one thread, and it's more exciting to sort of discover what the story is going to be and surprise myself. And I think those are the best scenes when I'm like, okay, I didn't think it was going to go that way, but so yeah, definitely a pantser. I'm gonna introduce myself that way from now on.
Cool, a proud pantser. What made you want to write about this subject in particular, and how long did it take you to write it?
Yeah, so as I said, this time in history, I felt that I didn't know that much about it. We all kind of have an overview of this time in history in our education, right? We learn about slavery, we learn about the political associations with that and the ramifications, but we don't really learn about the people. And so again, I really wanted to get into their heads, into the individual experiences that existed, and that history just can't, written history doesn't have time for, right? The smaller people that get forgotten. And so I sort of studied the time period without ever thinking I'd read a book about it. I took every history class I could in undergrad and in college and in grad school, just trying to listen to the stories. I think it comes down to being a writer and just wanting to hear stories of people. I had a great sort of course about African American history that I think stayed within me until I got to the point at Columbia where I was writing this thesis, and I began with this scene of a midwife, and I didn't know what time period she was going to be in, where what her history was. I just knew she was in a cabin. This woman was giving birth on the floor, and there was a black-eyed child. And the question for me was, what is her history? What limitations does she have in her knowledge? What does she bring to this sort of experience? And all sort of blossomed from there, from what I'd learned and replicating by doing research along the way. But never really knew the two things would come together until I started writing.
Wow, that's cool to hear. Can you talk about your Ghanaian heritage and how that informs your writing?
Yeah, so my parents are both from Ghana. They immigrated to England, where I was born, and then to America. I think growing up, I had a very sort of outsider view of their history, of their background, and of being an American and being British, and sort of just it allowed me to sort of view things from the outside, I think, and think about it a lot. So I think that comes through very much in Conjure Women, is sort of exploring one's history and exploring how people identify themselves, and specifically the Ghanaian history. Of course, Ghana was a major port during the slave trade. There was a slave castle right on the coast of Ghana, which was then called the Gold Coast. I actually got to see that castle when I was working on this project, and it didn't ultimately work into the time period of the book, since it's a little bit maybe 100 years into the future. But just sort of reflecting on going to that castle and really thinking of that was the last time that those people got to see Africa. They got to see their home. They're trying to incorporate that sense of my personal history and the sort of disparate experience of being African but not being from there. Really formulated the book in that sense. And then, of course, there's sort of a tradition of oral history, of storytelling that definitely comes from my parents. So Nancy stories were a big part of Conjure Women, which are actually, I discovered also sort of accidentally reading the Bear Fox and Brer, I'm picking out Brer Fox and Brer Rabbit stories, sorry, that are part of African American history and African American oral traditions, share so many parallels with the Nancy stories, Nancy being the trickster spider in Ghana. And so just, reading history, I would see these stories of Bear Fox and Bear Rabbit, and I said, I've heard these before. Like, I heard these in my childhood from my parents going to sleep. I was like, these are similar stories. So discovering that connection, I think, also fit into what I wanted to discuss in Conjure Women and what is being passed down and what's remembered. All of those ideas come back again and again in the novel.
Thank you. It is said that fiction is the lie that tells the truth, and your novel really brings to life the horrors of slavery. Can you tell us about the research that you did?
Yeah, so as I said, I mentioned the slave castle that I was able to visit on the west coast of Ghana. And that was sort of, again, an emotional research. Wasn't so much the facts of the places as walking around and taking in sort of what that experience might have been like, using that. On a more sort of hands-on practical level, I read a lot of diaries, newspaper articles, even farm, almanac histories from that time period to really sort of get a day-to-day sense. Again, you have the war, you have political leadership at the time, sort of that sort of bigger overview. I really wanted to get into the people, into the histories, and so one of the things I used as well, which was a huge resource, was the Works Progress Administration, which was actually done in the 1930s as a study interviewing some of the last people that remembered slavery at that time period. So they were usually in their 70s and their 80s. And the government created this program for them to be interviewed and their memories to be written down. And so that was a huge resource for the book, just having those voices and having those, those memories and those little details and really trying to incorporate those in the novel was huge for me. Of course, also incorporating the sort of complicated history of that as well. I mean, if the government comes to your door and says, well, what was it like for you to experience this? I mean, there's going to be a complex sort of duality in what you're telling as well. Trying to explore that and really look under what history presents on the surface and really trying to fill in the blanks.
Wow, that's it sounds like you were on quite a journey in terms of researching.
That was very sort of emotional and sort of cognitively a sort of strange thing to think about, trying to put yourself in that time period was very harrowing. I think it ultimately helped shape the book tremendously.
Why do you feel that it's important to tell stories about what real people experienced during slavery?
I think I think naturally we all we don't want to look at sort of ugly history, right? We don't want to look at humanity's failings and cruelty and violence. And I think there is also sort of an emotional distance that we put on ourselves from sort of seeing these images, right? We've seen the slave being whipped. We've seen the person in chains. We sort of don't want to explore those things. And I think I felt that trepidation as well, even writing it, that this is something we have seen before. So maybe we don't want to see a slave story again. So I think writing about it, I really confronted, well, why do I think these need to be explored? Why do I need to speak about these people? And I think part of the answer there was not letting them be forgotten, to give them humanity, by giving them not only their experiences as, say, runaway slaves or workers, or people being punished or enslaved, also give them full life and things they loved, and the relationships and the complications of being human and being alive, no matter what circumstance. So I really wanted to keep history, but also, as I said, delve deeper and really remember them as humans, as people, as part of a time period. And also, I think, just on a larger scale, there's a sense that this is our American history. It's something we have to grapple with. I think something that comes up a lot in the novel is facing your ghosts and your demons and really looking them in the face and saying, what is this, and how does it shape me, and what can I do about it? And so I think that's another reason why we sort of have to look at this history, especially the painful parts, to say, well, this is something that happened. How is it shaping us now? How are we grappling with it?
That's actually a great segue to my next question. I read a review of your book that said, the hatred on the faces of the mob that stormed the US Capitol on January 6th are the spiritual descendants of the hatred on the faces hidden under the post-Civil War masks of the KKK, who haunt the later chapters of your story. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, that is a heavy quote. Yeah, certainly. I think me writing this, in 2016, 2017, leading up to 2020 when it was published, those were things I was absolutely thinking about, is the trajectory. How did we get from there to here, and what lingers? What is still a prevalent issue in this country? And I think one thing I wanted to explore in how I formed the novel, and looking in that 10-year Reconstruction era, was the change from the slave masters to the KKK, right? So there's this trajectory of their wounds. They are grappling with their master and his sort of rule. And by the end of the novel, they've created for themselves a life, but new threat is encroaching on them from the opposite end, and it's these sort of places that they see in the woods end up being men in KKK robes. And so wanted that sort of through story to be clear that this is an evolving history. The history evolves, and it has repercussions that aren't just limited to one time period or one war, but really have long tendrils and long planted seeds in our country that we have not grappled with. And so I think that is a very apt quote in seeing those faces, and seeing again the faces of the KKK, and seeing again the faces of the slave owners, and having that echo. The book, I try not to have an answer. I try to have an answer, but I try not to dictate. I'm trying to explore my own confusion, my own sort of complicated place in history, right? And so there's a scene partway through the novel that I remember working on with my editor, and she said, well, this scene, it doesn't really go anywhere. And I said, well, that's, I don't have an answer for how the scene is completed, but it's a scene in which there's a dead body, or rather a runaway slave runs onto the plantation and dies, and they find his body and they don't know who he is or where he comes from. And that for me was something I wrote in direct conversation with George Floyd and the Ahmaud Arbery's of the world, and thinking of someone who is hurt that looks like you. You don't know their history, you don't know their story, and you're still compelled, and you're still sort of echoing back to your own pain and your own history. And so in that scene, they sort of try to figure out who he is, and they can't, and they say, well, he looks like my brother, and he looks like my father, and that sort of scene sort of ends with them burying the body, but really never having any closure. And I think that is something, again, that goes back to that idea of reflections of where we are and what it means in a larger scale.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about your character, Rue? What was your inspiration for her, and why do you think she's such a compelling figure?
Rue was a lot of fun to write, actually. I will say.
I love Rue.
Changing gears. But Rue was a lot of fun to write because, again, I don't think I planned her too much. I think I discovered her through the writing. That was sort of a joy. And because of the scope of the novel, she does sort of grow up. She's sort of a precocious child, and she has these different experiences, and we get to see her sort of as a child and then as a young woman. So that was sort of fun for me to just explore what does that look like growing up. I think the main thing about Rue is, she is Conjure Woman, right? She is the midwife. She's sort of this figure we've seen time and time again, the healer in the community. We're so close to her that we get to see some of her doubts and some of her questioning and some of her not really being sure what she can do to help people. So I think it was also important for me to sort of unpack that character, that idea of the midwife who knows everything and knows all about the babies and is wizened, and see her as a young woman and see some of her doubts and really sort of explore that. I think that makes her very human. I think that's why people like her, hopefully.
Yeah, she's very complex.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about her relationship with her master's daughter, Varina, and how that relationship evolves over the course of the novel?
Yeah, so one of the things that my research was sort of drawn to was this idea that the slave children and the slave owners' children grow up very close together, grow up often playing with each other, often not really, as children do, not really understanding the larger context of the world they live in. And they're learning through all these different sort of Varina and Rue are learning their roles in society. They sort of both have these diminished roles because Rue is this sort of Southern belle whose life is sort of dictated for her. She's also going to learn that she has control over Rue. The world is telling her that she, is more important than Miss May Belle or the older slaves or the older Black people in the community. That her whiteness has given her some kind of privilege, but also she's often, held back by her father and the men in her life, and grows to great complexity for the novel. Just this idea of these two children sort of being distant in a way and then learning about the world was something I really wanted to explore. Again, no definitive answers, but I think it was just interesting to look at, okay, what do we come into the world? What are our prejudices? What prejudices do we learn? How does life shape us? The people we become. And so Rue and Varina are these sort of 2 points in the story who these 2 women who have very different lives while growing up in the same class.
And how about Rue's mother, May Belle? Can you just talk about her a little bit?
May Belle's another fun one. She also is a Conjure Woman, right? In the novel, she teaches Rue sort of all the arts, and Miss May Belle is fun because she is a Conjure Woman, right? She's the midwife, she's the healer that, as I said before, that we've seen before, right? We were sort of enamored by her skill and her magic and her confidence. We do see behind her veil a little bit, but she also has that sort of mother quality of we never quite know her, and we admire her, and we want to be her and don't want to be her at the same time. Rue grapples with that a lot, trying to emulate her, but also blaze her own path. And so I think the relationship, this is a mother-daughter dynamic, and the sort of unknowableness of the adults in your life, and then sort of grappling with the fact that you live in a different time than, say, your mother did. Her expectations for you are different than your expectations for yourself, or the world that you end up living in. And so I got to play a lot with that in their story, is just their relationship and how it changes as Rue grows and the things Miss May Belle teaches her.
Yeah, some of those lessons are really tough too.
Yeah, yes, especially in the extremes, you know, in the extreme situations that they find themselves.
And how about Brew Abel? Can you talk about him and just what his role is?
Yeah, so Brew Abel, I mentioned him at the beginning as well. He's that sort of charismatic preacher, again, sort of a genre idea that we're used to seeing that I like to sort of unknit and unpick and look at. So he kind of comes into the town, and he is the symbol of sort of this new sort of revivalist movement at this time period, sort of charismatic preacher and the loud, thunderous, almost magical sort of religious experience that's very appealing in this time period for everyone, because of, you know, things that they lived through, for the war, for the destruction, or this idea of freedom and trying to decide what you believe after you know, a lifetime of being told what you should believe, or you know, picking up the bare scraps of what you can believe. So he is a very dynamic force and sort of thrives as Rue's sort of antagonist, because she's sort of traditional, and again, she's learned from her mother the sort of earthy practices and the sort of magic at the root and things like that, which are at odds with Abel's very sort of masculine Christianity that he brings. And so it becomes sort of the two pillars that the community is vacillating between: is, are they going to believe what Abel says, or are they going to believe what Rue says? And I think, again, they sort of act as these sort of pillars in history of those two sort of changes in, especially the African American community, of faith and finding themselves in their history.
Bit about the baby they call Bean, and how his birth affects the town. And can you maybe talk a little bit about his black eyes? And I was always wondering, is that an actual condition, or is that a metaphor?
Yeah, so Bean, a lot of the things in the novel are very real. They're very root, again, the practices that Rue and Miss May Belle use all have roots in real practices. Everything is pretty much real except for Bean. Bean is as much of a fabrication of medical oddities as I could come up with, for that exact reason, because I think him is something that the community fears, or that they project sort of a strangeness or a difference onto, was very important for the story. So I was very careful to sort of pick just things that seemed odd outwardly, in the sense of sort of horror tropes and things we've been taught to think are problems, and etc. So for Bean, as the novel goes on, he grows up, and we kind of find, not to reveal too much, but we kind of find that it's more about the perception of his perceived strangeness, any actual medical issue, or any limitations that he might have. And so for me, that was something that was really important, to sort of make it about perception, which again is a very huge part of the novel as a whole. And the black eyes were definitely a callback to sort of horror tropes and that sort of very visceral experience, which I felt like was fun to kind of pair with historical novel and put those two things together.
What are the haints in your story, and what is the role that they play?
Yeah, so a haint is a sort of colloquial term for a ghost. So they're being haunted by these spirits that they believe are sort of roaming in the woods, and perhaps part of Miss May Belle's greater curse that is sort of keeping them isolated from the rest of America and the things that are changing, and keeping them undiscovered by people who might, take offense to their sort of freeness and their sort of isolation. So the Haints, the ghosts, are, of course, metaphorical in that sense that they sort of are those things that, as I said, they don't want to look at, they don't want to grapple with, and they usually have echoes with things they remember from slavery, or it'll look like their master. There's one that sort of goes for the town that they think is Varina. They also kind of refuse to look closer, and so it's that feeling of history again repeating and echoing and sort of lingering, and the need to look at it and really say what it is, and really explore it, and hopefully not be so afraid of it. So yeah.
Okay, cool. I have one more question, and then we do have some questions from our audience. So my final question is, your novel goes back and forth in time between the Civil War era and just, or right before the Civil War and just after the war during Reconstruction. And the post-war period is a very short time period before the Jim Crow era begins. So how does your story kind of fit in the bigger timeline?
Yeah, so when I began the novel, as I said, I was really interested in that 10-year time period, right, the Reconstruction era, which is interesting because it is, and very clearly is, sort of a 10-year period after the Civil War. There was sort of this, there was freedom, but there's also sort of a sense of what were the rules, what do we do with this, what is allowed, because you haven't changed anything fundamentally about people's beliefs, right? You've just changed the laws. And so I was really taken with, okay, all of a sudden, Black people could vote, Black people could hold office, and they did in this 10-year time period, which to me was surprising because I hadn't really learned that sort of history, right? We learned more about years after. And so I think that they had this moment in time where they had this sort of agency was really where I wanted to place things. But then again, in looking at that, I realized to tell that 10-year time period, I had to look at what came prior, right? So that's when the braid sort of was formed, in looking at Ruth's childhood, but also looking at what led up to the Civil War, what led up to the sort of change that is now what they're grappling with. So that's why the novel is framed as it is, with sort of interweaving of history, because you can't really experience time without remembering what came before. And so I think that it very clearly wove itself in and out. And then there is sort of a jump to the future a little bit towards the end, just sort of reminding us that time is ongoing, right? That history is, we're living in it, but it doesn't just stop, in a 10-year time period or when the book ends. And so there's sort of a flash forward that happens in the end to remind you that this is all sort of things that repeat and things that echo. And I think that was I go back and forth between what I think is the message of the novel, right? Some days it's one thing and some days it's another, but I think one thing I keep coming back to is reflecting on history and living with it, and really unpacking it and see how it forms who you are and how it forms your future.
Well, thank you. Thank you for so thoughtfully answering my many questions. Let's get to the questions from the audience. Interactions between Rue and Varina thrum with a dangerous power equation. Rue is a bestie, but is always about to cross the line. How did you so convincingly get into the heads of your characters?
Yeah, I think it was exploration. It was I was very interested in these two little girls growing up together, as I said, as the people that they were as children, the people that they would become as adults, and how do they get there, and how much is formed by who they are and how much is formed by their experiences in this time period. And so their sort of contentious relationship just begins with that friendship and that sort of innocence of childhood and sort of curiosity, right? They get into a lot of trouble together, and that that makes them close as well, that sort of shared learning. Then the ways in which, you know, life sort of divides them, but also sort of the things that they want for themselves divide them. Sort of at odds throughout the novel. One's on top and one's on the bottom, is becomes an image in the novel. They sort of feel like they're tied together and that they have to grapple with each other. And so it was just about unpacking that relationship and what that looks like as you grow up.
What I thought was a question is actually a comment about my question about being. And this person says, great question. I also wondered about Bean's appearance. So I wasn't the only one who
lots of great
curious about that. We don't have any other questions.
Right.
Is there anything you want to say to leave the audience with?
No, I think, you know, Conjure Women, as I said, it's my debut. It came out April 2020, and sort of a crazy time for all of us, and a crazy time to think about sort of some of the themes of the novel of finding yourself in a historical moment and sort of still having all the things that you grapple with. I think it was a surprise for me to sort of have this book about healing and medicine, sickness, and all of that sort of come out the time that it did. I'm also sort of oddly grateful that it came out when it did, because there's so many opportunities like this to sort of connect with readers, and it's exciting that people keep discovering it. And it's, I think we're a day after International Women's Day, so I think it's also fitting for this, a book about sort of womanhood and growing up. And so yeah, it's been a joy to talk about it and sort of revisit it a little bit for me as well. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I really appreciate your time with us tonight.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
And thank you to those who tuned in, and have a good evening.